put your phone or device aside and immerse yourself in this audio story. Perfect for listening on the move, while relaxing, or for bedtime listening. We release new stories daily, so make sure to like and subscribe to not miss out. This story is based on true events. The Ghost Ship. On November 5th, 1991, a naked body was pulled from the Atlantic Ocean near the Canary Islands. The man was obese, elderly, and according to the initial report, had drowned after falling from his luxury yacht in the middle of the night. But within hours, investigators discovered something that transformed this from a tragic accident into one of the darkest financial crimes of the 20th century. Inside the dead man's empire, auditors found a hole. Not a small hole, a crater. £460 million had vanished from the pension funds of 32,000 workers. The man floating in the ocean hadn't just stolen from his employees. He had bet their retirements, their security, their futures on a desperate gamble to save himself. And he had lost. This is the story of Robert Maxwell, a media tycoon who built an empire on lies, ruled through fear, and when the walls began closing in, chose to take everything down with him. Some call it suicide, others call it murder. But what's undeniable is this: Robert Maxwell committed one of the most brazen acts of corporate theft in history, and he did it while smiling for the cameras. Robert Maxwell wasn't born a tycoon. He was born January Ludwig Hyman Benjamin Hoch in 1923, in a desperately poor village in Czechoslovakia. His childhood was one of poverty, violence, and survival. When the Nazis swept through Eastern Europe, they didn't just take his country, they took his entire family. His mother, father, and most of his siblings were murdered in Auschwitz. Young Jan escaped, joined the British Army, and reinvented himself completely. He changed his name, changed his accent, changed his story. By the time he emerged in post-war Britain, Jan Hoch was gone. In his place stood Captain Robert Maxwell, war hero, decorated soldier, and a man with something to prove to the world that had tried to erase him. What happened next was a masterclass in ambition, reinvention, and the ruthless accumulation of power. Maxwell understood something fundamental about the post-war world. Information was the new currency. While others chased manufacturing or real estate, he went after publishing. He started small, distributing scientific journals and academic texts. But he didn't stay small. In 1951, he acquired Pergamon Press, a small scientific publisher. Under his control, Pergamon became a powerhouse, dominating the academic publishing world. Maxwell had found his formula: acquire undervalued assets, squeeze every penny of value from them, and project an image of unstoppable success. He was brilliant. He was charismatic. He was also, as his employees would discover, utterly ruthless. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, Maxwell expanded aggressively. He bought newspapers, printing companies, and distribution networks. He entered politics, becoming a Labour member of Parliament. He cultivated relationships with world leaders, from Leonid Brezhnev to Mikhail Gorbachev. His connections were vast, his influence growing. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. In 1969, Maxwell attempted to sell Pergamon Press to an American company called Liasco. During the due diligence process, investigators discovered that Maxwell had been inflating Pergamon's profits through aggressive accounting tricks. The deal collapsed. British regulators investigated and concluded that Maxwell was unfit to run a public company. For most men, this would have been the end. For Robert Maxwell, it was barely a pause. He spent the 1970s rebuilding, scheming, waiting for his moment. And in 1984, that moment arrived. The British Printing Corporation, a struggling publishing conglomerate, came up for sale. Maxwell swooped in, acquired it, and renamed it the Mirror Group. Suddenly, he owned the Daily Mirror, one of Britain's biggest tabloid newspapers. He was back, not just back, triumphant. He became a media baron, a public figure, a man who dined with prime ministers and controlled the narrative read by millions every morning. But the empire he was building had a fatal flaw. It wasn't built on solid ground. It was built on debt, deception, and the systematic looting of his own companies. Maxwell ruled his empire like a tyrant. Employees described him as terrifying, a 6'2", 300-pound force of nature who would scream, threaten, and humiliate anyone who questioned him. He fired people on a whim. He demanded absolute loyalty. He controlled every decision, every penny, every headline. His business model was simple: expand constantly, acquire relentlessly, and when cash ran short, simply borrow more. By the late 1980s, Maxwell controlled over 400 companies spread across multiple countries. His corporate structure was deliberately labyrinthine: shell companies within shell companies, loans moving between entities, assets hidden in offshore accounts. Nobody, not even his closest executives, understood the full picture. That was intentional, because Maxwell had discovered something dangerous. If you controlled the books and confused the auditors, you could move money anywhere you wanted, including into your own pockets. But here's where the story turns from corporate excess into something far darker. In the late 1980s, Maxwell made a catastrophic bet. He decided to take on Rupert Murdoch directly, acquiring Macmillan Publishing in New York for over $2 billion. It was the biggest acquisition of his career. It was also completely unaffordable. To finance the deal, Maxwell borrowed enormously, but the debt payments were crushing. His companies were hemorrhaging cash. The stock prices of his publicly traded companies began to fall. Banks started asking uncomfortable questions, and that's when Robert Maxwell crossed a line that would destroy thousands of lives. He began stealing from the pension funds, not borrowing, not temporarily moving money around, stealing. The Mirror Group and Maxwell Communication Corporation employed over 30,000 people. Those workers had pension funds, money set aside for their retirements, legally protected, supposedly untouchable. Maxwell controlled the pension fund trustees. He controlled the accountants. He controlled the flow of information. So he simply started moving pension fund money into his private companies to cover debts, prop up stock prices, and maintain the illusion of success. The mechanics were deceptively simple. Maxwell would instruct pension fund managers to loan money to his private companies at absurdly favorable terms, or he would order pension funds to buy shares in Maxwell companies at inflated prices, or he would pledge pension fund assets as collateral for his personal loans. Each transaction, taken individually, could be made to look legitimate with the right paperwork, but collectively, they represented the systematic looting of worker savings on a scale Britain had never seen. Maxwell didn't steal tens of millions. He stole hundreds of millions, 460 million pounds, the equivalent of over $1 billion today. And he did it while continuing to smile for cameras, give interviews, and lecture others on business ethics. By 1991, the walls were closing in. Banks were demanding repayment. Auditors were asking questions Maxwell could no longer deflect. The stock prices of his companies were collapsing. Behind the scenes, Maxwell was frantically moving money, hiding assets, and trying to arrange emergency financing. He flew between London, New York, and Jerusalem, searching desperately for someone, anyone, who would extend him credit. But the numbers didn't lie. His empire was insolvent. The pension funds were empty, and there was no way out. On November 4th, 1991, Robert Maxwell boarded his yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, in the Canary Islands. He made several phone calls that evening, urgent, angry conversations with bankers and lawyers. Around midnight, he was seen on deck by crew members. By 4:25 a.m., he was gone. His naked body was discovered hours later, floating in the Atlantic. The official cause of death was accidental drowning, possibly due to a heart attack. But the circumstances surrounding his death remained deeply suspicious. Was it suicide? A man facing total ruin, criminal prosecution, and the collapse of everything he'd built, choosing to end it on his own terms? Or was it something darker? Maxwell had connections to intelligence agencies. He had secrets about powerful people. Some believe he was murdered to silence him. The truth died with him in the ocean. But here's what makes this story truly chilling. The theft didn't end with Maxwell's death. When investigators began unraveling his empire, they discovered that the looting was far worse than anyone had imagined. Maxwell hadn't just stolen from the pension funds. He had created an elaborate web of offshore companies, secret bank accounts, and fraudulent transactions designed to hide the scale of the theft. Money had been moved to Liechtenstein, to Switzerland, to the British Virgin Islands. Investigators traced funds through more than 400 different corporate entities. Some of that money was never recovered. But the real horror wasn't the missing money. It was the human cost. 32,000 workers woke up to discover their pensions were gone. People who had worked for decades, who had trusted that their retirement savings were protected, found themselves with nothing. Printing press operators, journalists, cleaners, secretaries, ordinary people who had committed no crime except working for Robert Maxwell. Some lost their homes. Others were forced back into work in their 70s. The psychological trauma was immense. One victim described it as financial rape, a violation so complete, so personal, that many never recovered. The British government eventually stepped in. After years of legal battles and public pressure, a compensation fund was established. Workers received about half of what they were owed, better than nothing, but far from justice. Maxwell's sons, Kevin and Ian, were prosecuted for their role in the fraud. They were eventually acquitted, though their reputations were destroyed. The trial revealed shocking details about how the Maxwell empire operated. Employees testified about being ordered to backdate documents, falsify records, and lie to auditors. They described a culture of fear, where questioning Maxwell meant instant termination. They revealed how Maxwell would personally approve every significant financial transaction, maintaining iron control over the flow of money. But what the trial couldn't answer was the deeper question. How did one man steal so much, for so long, from so many, without anyone stopping him? The answer lies in the nature of power itself. Robert Maxwell understood something fundamental about corporate structures. If you control the information, you control reality. He surrounded himself with people who were either loyal, terrified, or complicit. He fired anyone who asked difficult questions. He rotated accountants and auditors to prevent anyone from seeing the full picture. He used his media empire to shape his public image, presenting himself as a self-made billionaire and philanthropist. He leveraged his connections to world leaders to project an aura of legitimacy, and he exploited a critical weakness in British pension law, that fund trustees could be company executives, creating an obvious conflict of interest that Maxwell ruthlessly exploited. The Maxwell scandal led to sweeping reforms in British pension legislation. New laws were passed requiring independent trustees, stronger regulatory oversight, and better protection for pension assets. But those reforms came too late for the 32,000 victims of Maxwell's greed. What makes Robert Maxwell's story so disturbing isn't just the scale of the theft, it's the psychology behind it. Here was a man who had survived the Holocaust, who had rebuilt himself from nothing, who had achieved extraordinary wealth and influence. He could have lived comfortably on legitimate earnings. He could have retired with his reputation intact. Instead, he risked everything, his legacy, his freedom, his family's future, to maintain an illusion of success. Psychologists who have studied the case suggest Maxwell was driven by something deeper than greed. He was driven by a pathological need for validation, a desperate hunger to prove he belonged among the elite. The boy from the Czech village who lost everything to the Nazis had become so obsessed with never being powerless again that he destroyed thousands of lives to maintain his facade of invincibility. In the end, his employees paid the price for his ego. The Maxwell case reveals uncomfortable truths about wealth and power in modern capitalism. It shows how corporate structures can be weaponized by charismatic leaders to commit massive fraud. It demonstrates how regulatory oversight often fails until after the damage is done. It exposes the fundamental vulnerability of pension systems that rely on employer honesty and good faith. But perhaps most chillingly, it illustrates how easily a narrative of success can mask systematic corruption. Robert Maxwell was celebrated, honored, and trusted by millions. Major banks lent him billions. World leaders took his phone calls. Newspapers treated him as a legitimate business icon, all while he was committing one of the largest thefts in British history. The warning signs were there. The 1969 scandal, the mounting debt, the opaque corporate structure. But people chose to believe the story Maxwell told, rather than investigate the reality beneath it. That willful blindness allowed the theft to continue for years. Today, Robert Maxwell's name is synonymous with corporate fraud and pension theft. His death remains a mystery, suicide, accident, or murder, depending on who you ask. His legacy is one of betrayal on a staggering scale. But his story is more than just a cautionary tale about one corrupt tycoon. It's a lesson about the systems that enable such people, about the dangers of concentrated power without accountability, about the importance of independent oversight and strong regulation, about the human cost when corporate greed goes unchecked. The 32,000 workers who lost their pensions didn't lose them because of market forces or economic downturns. They lost them because one man decided his ego was more important than their futures, because one man was allowed to operate with impunity for decades, because the structures meant to protect them failed. And here's the truly unsettling part. While the Maxwell scandal led to reforms in Britain, similar vulnerabilities exist in pension systems around the world. The temptation to raid pension funds during financial crises hasn't disappeared. The techniques Maxwell used, complex corporate structures, offshore accounts, compliant trustees, are still available to those willing to use them. The regulatory systems designed to prevent another Maxwell remain underfunded and often outmatched by sophisticated financial engineering. Which raises an uncomfortable question. How many other Robert Maxwells are out there right now? How many corporate empires are built on hidden debt and looted pension funds? How many charismatic leaders are one financial crisis away from following Maxwell's path? We can't know until the bodies float to the surface. On that November morning in 1991, when Robert Maxwell's body was pulled from the Atlantic, the world lost one of its most flamboyant and controversial businessmen. But 32,000 workers lost far more. They lost their security, their retirement, their trust in the systems meant to protect them. Some of those workers are still alive today, still living with the consequences of Maxwell's theft, still wondering how one man was allowed to destroy so many lives, still waiting for a justice that will never fully come. Robert Maxwell's empire collapsed into the sea with him, but the damage he inflicted continues to ripple outward decades later. A reminder that behind every corporate scandal, every financial fraud, every tale of wealth and excess, there are real people. People who trusted, people who worked, people who lost everything. And in the end, that's the darkest truth of all. Robert Maxwell didn't just steal money. He stole futures. He stole dignity. He stole the one thing his employees could never get back: time. And he took that secret with him to the bottom of the ocean, leaving behind only wreckage, ruin, and the haunting question that still echoes today. If it could happen to them, could it happen to you? Subscribe and listen to our next story below.